Today we'll be discussing about the mechanisms of actions of antibacterial drugs. Before we discuss the mechanisms of antibacterial drugs, understanding few terminologies is important. One of such terminologies is antimicrobial agents. The antimicrobial agents, as the name suggests, these are the chemicals or the agents which are used for the treatment of microbial infections. When I say microbial infections, there are different types of microorganisms, and based on which type of microorganisms these agents are used for, the antimicrobials can be classified into different types. One, there could be antibacterials, there can be antiviral agents, there can be antifungal agents. So antibacterial agents, that means these are the drugs which are used for the treatment of bacterial infections. Antivirals, that means these are the drugs used for the treatment of viral infections. And antifungal, that means these are the drugs used for the treatment of fungal infections. Now few more terminologies. One terminology is called as chemotherapy, and the other term is antibiotic. Chemotherapy, if you split this word into two, one is chemo and second is therapy. So that means use of chemical drugs or chemical agents for the treatment. Therapy is treatment. So use of chemicals or the drugs for the treatment of certain diseases is called as chemotherapy. Now chemotherapy is used for two types of diseases. One is the infections and second is the cancer. So initially chemotherapy word was used for the treatment of infections, but now it is more commonly used for the treatment of cancer. So anti-cancer drugs are also termed as chemotherapy. The next terminology is antibiotic. Antibiotic means an agent or a drug which is derived from the microorganism, and it is used for the treatment of another microorganism infections. So to be called as antibiotic, that agent has to be derived from microorganism, and this agent which is derived from the microorganism is used for the treatment of infections caused by other microorganisms. So that agent has to qualify two things. One is it has to be derived from the microorganism, and it is used for the treatment of infections caused by other microorganisms. Now these microorganisms, they can be either killed by the antibiotic or their growth can be suppressed. So if the microorganism is killed by the antibiotic, then it is called as the bactericidal agent. And when the drug is able to suppress the growth of microorganism, then it will be called as bacteriostatic agent. Now if you remember the definition that we spoke about antibacterials, that means any drug which is used for the treatment of infections caused by the bacteria. An antibiotic has to be derived from microorganism, which means all antibiotics, they are antibacterials. But all antibacterials, they are not antibiotics, because some of the antibacterial drugs, they might be derived from some other sources. So this is the introduction and few terminologies that we should be knowing before we go and discuss the mechanisms and the uses of antibacterial drugs. Now let us discuss the mechanisms of antibacterial drugs. Now in order to understand the mechanisms of antibacterial drugs, we have to understand the structure of a microorganism. Now the microorganism, the bacteria, because we are talking about bacterial infections, so bacteria, it has a cell wall, bacteria has a cell membrane. Inside there is a ribosome, and in this ribosome there is a synthesis of protein which happens here. Then there is a genetic material, and in the bacterial structure or inside the bacterial cytoplasm, some metabolic functions they happen so that they are essential for the bacteria to survive. Now, in order to understand the use of antibacterial drugs or the mechanisms of antibacterial drugs, this structure is important. So certain drugs, they are able to work on the cell wall. That means they inhibit the formation of the cell wall, or they make the cell wall weaker. Some drugs, they act on the cell membrane and they make the cell membrane more permeable. Some drugs, they act on the ribosome so that the protein synthesis is inhibited. Some drugs, they inhibit the metabolic functions in the bacteria, and some of them, they interfere with the functions of genetic material. So now let us discuss which are these drugs which work on the bacterial cell wall. There are several drugs which work by inhibiting the formation of cell wall. One category of drugs are beta lactam drugs. So beta lactams, there are different types of beta lactams. We will discuss that in one of the lectures. So beta lactams, they inhibit the cell wall. Then there is a drug called as vancomycin. Vancomycin also inhibits cell wall. There is a drug called as cycloserine, bacitracin. So these drugs, they work on the cell wall. They inhibit the cell wall or they make the cell wall weaker. So this is one target of the drugs which are used for the treatment of bacterial infections. Second category of drugs, they work on the cell membrane. The example include amphotericin B, polymyxin, nystatin. These drugs, they work on the cell membrane. So this is the second target of the antibacterial drugs. Many drugs, they work on the ribosome and they inhibit protein synthesis. Examples of these drugs include tetracycline, aminoglycosides, chloramphenicol, macrolides, linazolide. So there are many drugs which inhibit the synthesis of protein in the bacteria. So this is the third target of the antibacterial drugs. Some drugs, they inhibit the metabolic functions which are necessary for the bacteria to survive. The drugs in this category, sulfonamides, pyrimethamine, so these are the drugs which work by inhibiting the metabolic functions of the bacteria. The next target of the antibacterial drug, so some drugs, they inhibit the enzyme called as DNA gyrase. Some drugs inhibit the formation or synthesis of nucleic acid. The drugs which work by inhibiting DNA gyrase, the example is fluoroquinolone, and the drugs which inhibit the function or formation of DNA or DNA dependent RNA polymerase, the drug is rifampicin. So rifampicin inhibit the DNA dependent RNA polymerase. So this is overall the structure of the bacteria, and these are the different types of targets. So one target is cell wall, second target is a cell membrane, third target is inhibition of protein synthesis by acting on 50S or 30S ribosomal subunit. One target can be inhibition of metabolic functions in the bacteria, and second is on the genetic material by inhibiting DNA gyrase or DNA dependent RNA polymerase. So these are the different mechanisms of actions of antibacterial drugs. Thank you.